This presentation explores the connection between a particular view in the philosophy of science, one more often held by non-scientists, and the political and cultural views that we see exploding on the scene today. Now, this analysis is not new to me. It has been commented on by many people, but the way it's presented here was developed for my first year seminar class for college freshmen, and so may be an interesting way to view the situation.
So I want to explore the connection between philosophy of science, and in particular, the view of epistemic relativism, and how it leads to and is intertwined with the critical theory and identitarianism that are so popular now. As a reminder, let's quickly review some of the characteristics of science for people who may not have thought about this in a while. What does it mean to be doing science? We have the use of data and evidence. We have quantitative analyses, mathematical models, and statistical analyses on that data and evidence. We make reference to experiments and observations. We have the data and evidence and the analyses lead to the conclusions rather than the reverse. We don't want to start with the conclusions that we want and then gather data and evidence with that in mind. There's the idea of testability and repeatability. The theories and laws that we have should make predictions, and those predictions should be able to be tested with experiments and observations. And they should be able to be tested multiple times. We have the principle of falsifiability. There should be an experiment or observation by which any given theory or law could be shown to be false. If a theory or law does not suggest some experiment or observation by which it could be shown false, that is a problematic thing within science. Also, science seeks naturalistic explanations. So we want to explain phenomena with models that reference other natural phenomena. So for example, the motion of the planets are explained in terms of a theory of gravity. We don't say, well, we have the motion of planets and it must be God doing it however he wants. In science, we insist on naturalistic explanations, natural phenomena in terms of other natural phenomena. So with that in mind, let's introduce what I visualize as the philosophy of science continuum. And as a continuum, that means it's a spectrum of belief or opinion. Over here at one extreme, we have the view of most scientists, and probably the view that most people think they have about science, which is called scientific realism. Under the view of scientific realism, the scientific explanations that we have are generally literally accurate. So in particular, when we say that we have theories and models about electrons, that means that electrons are real physical entities in the universe that have the properties that we ascribe to them. However, in opposition to this, there is a school of thought within the philosophy of science that says nobody has ever actually seen an electron. All we ever see are the supposed effects of electrons on other things, on apparatuses, on other particles, on these things that we construct to detect electrons. And so there is a position of scientific anti-realism, which says that scientific observations of directly observed phenomena are accurate, but we can't prove that electrons actually exist. We can't even say that electrons actually exist. Our theories and laws about electrons have to be viewed as, at best, speculative or metaphorical. They can't be proven to be real entities because nobody's ever actually seen one. Now, it's interesting to note that the scientific anti-realist case has been taken up by creationists, especially those who would still like to be able to engage in some biological science. So they say, well, we can directly observe something about a frog's digestive system or something about a petri dish. And so all of that is okay. However, nobody was here to directly observe what happened in the past. And therefore, that science, the science of, say, evolution or geology or the origin of the universe, all of that is up there with electrons. We can't say that it is literally true. It is less verifiable than the science of things we can directly observe. Now, in general, though, in the philosophy of science, the scientific anti-realist position is not held by creationists. But then we can keep going, because if we've drawn a distinction between what we can directly see and what we can't, well, we might say we don't even trust our senses to be correct all the time, and we could bring up the example of optical illusions or auditory illusions. And so there is another position even farther this way called epistemic relativism. And epistemic relativism would say not only the scientific theories and models which discuss electrons and their properties can't be verified to be true because nobody's ever seen one. Even the scientific models and theories describing things that people can see with their senses also cannot be said to be true. The epistemic relativist position would say that uniquely true descriptions of reality are not possible, that there is somehow a subjective nature to reality. Whether you're talking about electrons or frogs, our descriptions of them from science cannot be said to be absolutely true, cannot be known to be true. Now let's look more carefully at the supposed distinction between the scientific realist case and the scientific anti-realist case. And let's take the example of what it might take to see something that we can see, or to make an observation of something that we can see. Let's say a bug. So here's the bug. And how do we see a bug? Generally with our eyes. And when the rubber hits the road, what's happening in our eyes? Well, on the retina, we have rod and cone cells, which convert incident light into voltages and currents, which then travel along nerves. So when we observe a bug, we have lights coming in through the eye, it's getting refracted by the lens, and it hits a part of the retina. Those cells on the retina convert the light into voltage and current signals, which then travel eventually down the optic nerve to the brain. And then we have built connections of neurons in the brain such that eventually our conscious mind processes that electrical voltage and current input and comes out with that we see a bug. So now let's contrast that with what it takes to observe an electron. In order to observe an electron, well, we have an electron, but we have to have it do some kind of interaction or process that results ultimately, no matter what it is, in some sort of electrical voltage or current. And that electrical voltage or current is then read out with some kind of device, which we then observe with our eyes. The light comes into our eyes, it hits the retina, the rod and cone cells convert it to electrical voltages and currents, which then travel down the optic nerve to the brain, and then we've learned to associate that pattern on the readout device with an electron. And so fundamentally, when it comes down to it, whether we're looking at a bug or whether we're looking at an electron, it all comes down to voltages and currents coming down the optic nerve, and then the arrangement of connections between neurons, and then the bridge to our conscious mind. And so it's very tough to justify a distinction, actually, between a bug and an electron. To say that we could really say that the bug is more real than the electron, because in both cases, it just comes down to electrical signals interfacing with the brain. It's difficult to justify a fundamental distinction between that which is directly observed and that which is inferred from observations. And so I believe that there is a slippery slope from the scientific anti-realist position into the epistemic relativist position. It's very difficult to maintain the scientific anti-realist position in the face of considerations like we just went through. Now, once we're in the epistemic relativist position, there are two branches there that one can go down. The first one is to say that uniquely true descriptions of reality are not possible because there is no objective actual reality, or at least we can't prove that there is an objective actual reality. And that position is called solipsism. Solipsism would say there is no objective external reality, or at least that we can't prove that there is. So for example, what if everything that you've ever seen, heard, and touched has been arranged for you in some kind of a giant illusion, like a big Truman Show, where it's all an act and the actual true nature of the universe is quite different? You can't prove that's not happening. Or let's take it a step farther. Maybe we don't need to act it all out. Maybe your brain is just connected to a bunch of electrical inputs that send all the right signals down the optical nerve and all the right signals down the nerves that come from the ears and all that to make you think that you're experiencing everything you've ever experienced. When in reality, you're just a brain in a jar and you have no idea what the reality's like outside of that. Or we could even go one step further and get rid of the actual physical brain and instead simulate all of the electrical signals and all of the connections between all of your neurons in software. Your entire experience could be a software simulation running on some computer somewhere. So the solipsistic position is that we could be in a software-hardware simulation, some kind of a macro dream state or something like that, where we are not actually accessing an objective external reality. And that is an interesting thing to consider. However, most people who take the epistemic relativistic position go down the other branch. And the other branch goes to the position which is called radical constructivism. And in radical constructivism, any knowledge is part of what they call a social construct, so that the concepts of true and false are not absolute but context dependent. There is no universal true and false. You can't make the statement that stars are giant balls of hot gas and have that statement be absolutely true. They don't believe that that statement can be absolutely true. They would say something like, there are many equally valid ways of knowing. So that saying that stars are giant balls of hot gas might be true in one context, but saying that stars are the spirits of our hunter ancestors might be true in some other context. And there is no actual way to objectively say that one of those things is true. Now, in principle, the radical constructivist view as part of epistemic relativism is politically neutral. It could, in principle, be held by somebody of any political partisan persuasion or no political partisan persuasion. It could just be a philosophical viewpoint. However, in reality, it is the position that is most favored by people on the political far left, and in particular the identitarian far left. That is the view that people's primary determining factor, or the most important thing about people is their demographic identity group. It is the case that radical constructivism is usually motivated by and is also a pathway to what I would call here leftist identitarianism. That is a very left-wing political viewpoint, and in particular, the flavor of left-wing viewpoint that is very obsessed with categories of identity. And let's see why that is. What about these statements that characterize the radical constructivist position? Any knowledge is part of a social construct, the concepts of true and false are context dependent, or there are many equally valid ways of knowing. What about that plays into this political belief? Well, you might support statements like this if, for example, your ideas are illogical or unfalsifiable or don't stand up to tests. If you want to make assertions that are illogical or don't stand up to tests or data or evidence, well, then you would like to say that tests, data, and evidence don't actually matter because science does not access anything that's uniquely true. There are many equally valid ways of knowing. You would also support this if you wish to degrade Western civilization and its accomplishments. Because, for whatever historical reasons, geographic and otherwise, most of the big advances in science in recent centuries that have led to the technological world that we have today were done in Western civilization. Now, whether or not that's a product of Western civilization is irrelevant here. If one wishes to degrade Western civilization, one important thing to do would be to degrade the clear scientific accomplishments. Well, a way to do that would be to degrade scientific accomplishment in general. If science does not uniquely access the truth, if in fact science doesn't access truth at all, as epistemic relativism would say, if there are many equally valid ways of knowing, well, then science is not that important. So then the radical constructivist program has two main thrusts that we can see if we observe a lot of what's happening. There is the abuse of science. And so people associated with radical constructivism, that is, people associated with the academic side of radical constructivism, they frequently use the terminology of science to confuse people and to sound smart without actually doing any real research, without actually doing the techniques of science. Because remember, they don't even believe that the techniques of science access real truth. And this abuse of science has been discussed at length by people such as Alan Sokal in the book Fashionable Nonsense and in the hoax paper that he submitted several decades ago and the fallout from that. And also James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, who more recently have submitted a batch of hoax papers and discussed all of the fallout from that. There is also the program to degrade science. And here the radical constructivists have attempted to associate logic and evidence with taboo. Because as we said, at least some of the things that they claim would not stand up to logic and evidence, do not have the characteristics of science that we saw, such as mathematical models, quantitative approaches, falsifiability, and testability. And so because their claims often don't stand up to logic, evidence, testability, and so on, they would like to degrade those things. They would like to associate them with sources of oppression. They would like to make them taboo. And so for some examples of the abuse of science, we can turn to some of the things that Alan Sokal has pointed out. So here's a quote from a humanities philosopher. Is E equals mc squared a sexed equation? Perhaps it is. Let's make the hypothesis that it is, insofar as it privileges the speed of light over other speeds. What seems to me to indicate the possible sexed nature of this equation is not directly its use by nuclear weapons, rather it's having privileged that which goes faster. Now here's a very classic example of invoking some concepts from science to sound smart. E equals mc squared. Well, that's Einstein, and everybody knows that Einstein is very smart. So the person saying this must be smart. But this is a complete misrepresentation, misunderstanding of what E equals mc squared is all about. It has absolutely nothing to do with sex, gender, or anything like that. It has nothing to do with privileging anything. This is simply invoking something about science where it has absolutely no relevance in order to make the person doing it seem smart and to confuse the reader. Here's another example, another humanities writer. If you will permit me to use one of those formulas which come to me as I write my notes, human life could be defined as a calculus in which 0 was irrational. The formula is not just an image, a mathematical metaphor. When I say irrational, I'm not referring to some unfathomable emotional state, but precisely what is called an imaginary number. Well, now, this is, first of all, just wrong. Irrational numbers are not imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers are multiples of the square root of -1. Irrational numbers are fractions that don't terminate in a decimal. But beyond that, neither of these have anything to do with human life. They're not irrational and imaginary in the sense that a person could be irrational or a ghost could be imaginary. This is, again, applying terms from science, and in this case mathematics, to something where they have absolutely no relevance in order to sound smart. And it also has the effect of degrading the precise meaning of irrational and imaginary numbers within science and mathematics. Here's another example with another philosopher. This quote here is referring to the alteration of perceptions by mass media. This distortion of causes and effects, this mysterious autonomy of effects, this cause-effect reversibility puts one in mind to some extent of chaos theory. Now, this is just completely wrong about the science. Chaos theory, in the context of mathematics and physics, does not reverse cause and effect. Cause and effect is still preserved in chaos theory. In chaotic systems, it's just that the results are highly sensitive to initial conditions, but they're still determined by the causes. The effects are still determined by the causes. So this person is, again, attempting to sound smart and profound by invoking a scientific concept that is irrelevant and invoking it incorrectly. Now, recently we have many examples of the abuse of science from Lindsay, Pluckrose, and Bogosian, who submitted a slew of hoax papers to academic journals in the fields that they label grievance studies. These are fields of humanities and social sciences that focus on the supposed grievances of identity groups, racial groups, sex and gender groups, and even there's fat studies. So I suppose that's weight groups. And they submitted these papers that were absolutely terrible, ridiculous research, and those papers were published. Here's one example. Human reactions to rape culture and queer performativity in urban dog parks. They, in order to submit this paper, went to a dog park, made some observations, and wrote about those observations. What they claimed was that dog parks are rape-condoning spaces and places of rampant canine rape culture. Now that's ridiculous, but it's also ridiculous that this journal accepted something that was a simple observation. This wasn't a study. There were no data or statistics or quantitative analyses. This was simply one person's description of something that they personally witnessed at one particular place at one particular time. And this was published in the journal called Gender, Place, and Culture. I've noted the impact factors of these journals to show that these journals are real. People do read them and cite them. Here's another example. In this paper, they simply took part of Hitler's Mein Kampf and replaced references to Jews with references to white males. This paper was accepted in the peer-reviewed Journal of Women in Social Work and published. This journal did not even check for plagiarism, nor did the reviewer. They simply published this text, which agreed with their general viewpoint. Again, no consideration to scientific methods, unclear language. We don't even have to go to hoax papers for such examples. We can go to real papers. Here was a paper submitted to the Journal of Tourism and Cultural Change. Again, a non-negligible impact factor in that journal, which means people read it and cite it. This person, if we read down below, analyzed accounts of my own erotic encounters with Dominican men. That was it. That's what this is, this person's own anecdotal encounters over some time, sexual encounters. And notice that he says at the top, in an attempt to move beyond the abstract signifying logics, he's attempting to, quote, move beyond something like logic and evidence into this other supposed way of carrying out a study or coming upon some information. Again, in a real journal, and now we can start to see both the abuse and the denigration of science that I mentioned. This article, published in this journal, Advances in Health Sciences Education, says here, health professionals' education is built on a structural foundation of modernity based on Eurocentric epistemologies. They are trying to make it sound bad that we have some current program of health professions education. They're trying to associate it with Eurocentric epistemologies and attempting to associate modernity with that. What's in modernity? Well, logic, evidence, technology, and all that. New ways of knowing, ways of knowing. Look at the title, New Ways of Knowing. That is directly from the radical constructivist view of science and knowledge. There are new ways of knowing. There is some other way of knowing about healthcare than the scientific way. Another hoax paper from Lindsay Pluck, Rosa Magosian that shows the denigration of science. Here they submitted a paper arguing for a framework for a feminist astronomy, where they said that the science of astronomy is and always has been intrinsically sexist and Western, and they can correct that by including feminist, queer, and indigenous astrology, such as horoscopes, as part of astronomical science. They are denigrating science. They're saying that astronomy, which studies things that have no sex or gender, planets, stars, dark matter, and they're saying that this science that studies things that has no sex and gender is in fact sexist and Western and masculinist, and we need to bring into it astrology and horoscopes. They are denigrating science. They are denigrating astronomy, and this was published in the peer-reviewed journal Women's International Forum, Women's Studies International Forum. Now, some people said that these hoax papers didn't prove a lot because these weren't the top journals in these fields. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, whether these are the top journals or not, but it doesn't matter. These are journals who get cited, who get referenced, and academics are getting jobs, tenure, and promotion based on publishing in these journals. Therefore, it does reveal a huge problem when papers that are just plagiarized, when papers that have no data or evidence, that are simple anecdote, get published in these journals. Lately, this denigration of science, logic, evidence has become much more pronounced. Here's a pamphlet that was recently spread to many math teachers. It says, Dismantling Racism in Mathematics Instruction. And here they give some examples of white supremacy in math classrooms. White supremacy, those words invoke the Klan or Nazis. And they say that we see white supremacy culture, Klan, Nazis, show up in mathematics classrooms in the following ways. And look at this. When the focus is on getting the right answer, because they are opposed to the whole concept of the right answer. They don't believe that there is a right answer, that there is something that can be said to be true, because they are epistemic relativists, radical constructivists. They are against the very idea of the right answer. And in fact, they are associating it with the worst thing, white supremacy. Look what else. It's white supremacy when students are required to show their work. Now, this particular program was sponsored by, as they say, generous financial support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So this is money that is not being spent on cures for tropical diseases or whatever else the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is supposed to be spending money on. They are spending money promoting the idea that getting the right answer and showing your work is white supremacy. Now, I'm sure that when Bill Gates gets into his private helicopter, he knows that it was designed by an engineer who wanted to get the right answer and who showed his work. And so there is a lot of hypocrisy here. But the program is clear. Demonize such things as the right answer. Here's an example of material that was promoted by the Smithsonian Museum. Aspects of white culture. Again, this is supposed to be something bad. And look what they say is bad. It's white culture. Emphasis on the scientific method, including objective and rational thinking, quantitative emphasis. All of these things that are at the bedrock of science are actually being demonized as white culture. Look what else. Hard work, work before play. All of these things that are the basic building blocks of doing a job well are also being demonized as aspects of white culture. They are really attempting to make it so that science is seen as a bad thing, that logic and evidence and objectivity and being quantitative are seen as a bad thing. They're associating it with white culture, the Klan and Nazis. There's even a supernatural aspect to a lot of left-wing identitarianism lately. Here's an article that's talking about white supremacy. And it says it's pulled forward by magnetism rather than repelled by its invisible force. An invisible force pervading the world. That is the definition of something supernatural. Lately, there's been a lot of academic talk about what they call black girl magic. And here they're not talking about magic like a magic show. They're talking about magic as in some supernatural force that does good things. This is a very supernaturalistic view of the world. And they have a very big program of unfalsifiable assumptions, unfalsifiable claims. Here's a common graphic that accompanies the White Fragility book. And let's look at some of the things that make one a white supremacist. Hiring discrimination and color blindness. These two things are the opposite. According to this, it is impossible not to be a white supremacist, because if you discriminate in hiring, you are a white supremacist. However, if you do the opposite and you are colorblind in hiring, you are also a white supremacist. The assertion that somebody or an institution is white supremacist is unfalsifiable. They are telling us there is no possible observation that could be done. There is no possible course of action that would not be white supremacist. Here's another example. Not believing experiences of POC or expecting to be taught by POC. This covers the entire possible spectrum of opinions and beliefs. One either has to not believe them or believe them. That's it. That's the only two options. And so what they're telling us is a person or institution is a white supremacist if they believe POC and if they don't believe POC. Their assertion that a person is a white supremacist is unfalsifiable. It is completely against what would constitute a good theory or hypothesis in the scientific context. And so this brings us to what I view as the vicious loop, the self-reinforcing loop between epistemic relativism, radical constructivism, and group-based grievances. We can start with epistemic relativism and the radical constructivist view that we could say it as science does not actually say anything uniquely true. Now, if one believes that science doesn't actually say anything uniquely true, then one is ready to abuse science, use scientific terms incorrectly, use scientific terms in order to sound smart and confuse people, because science isn't great or special anyway, so what's the problem? When science isn't great or special and gets abused, then we have the low-quality scholarship that constitutes the grievance studies fields that we've seen. The reliance on anecdote as opposed to data, as we saw, the no or improper use of data, no quantitative methods. We've seen how these assertions are oftentimes unfalsifiable, and we've seen how they're even, in some cases, supernatural. This is in contrast to the high standard of research in the natural sciences. Grievance study scholarship then feeds into radical identitarianism, because all of these results and papers come out saying how racist and sexist and weightist and ableist all of society and all these individuals are, how everything is white supremacist, including logic and evidence, and expecting to be taught by POC, and being colorblind and not being colorblind. And then in the radical identitarianist program, we see how they're trying to tell us that logic and rationality, objectivity, hard work, and other things are symptoms of whiteness or even white supremacy. They are terrible. And so when you have people who start to believe that logic and rationality are terrible, well, those people are clearly misinformed about science. Logic and rationality are good things, and they are good things about science. But these people are miseducated, misinformed to now believe that logic and rationality are bad. And therefore, they don't know, they are not in a position to understand how science works and how science comes to the conclusions that it does. How do we know what we know about electrons and dark matter and the Big Bang and viruses? And so then those people are primed to believe in epistemic relativism, radical constructivism, that science does not actually say anything uniquely true. And then we're just back in the loop. This connection between the abuse of science, the degradation of science, and the radical identitarian viewpoint has been articulated by many other people. Here's a quote from Lindsay, Pluckrose, and Bogosian, who say that this problem is most easily summarized as an overarching, almost fully sacralized belief that many common features of experience in society are socially constructed. These constructions are seen as being nearly entirely dependent upon power dynamics between groups of people, often dictated by sex, race, or gender sexual identification. All kinds of things accepted as having a basis in reality due to evidence are instead, in the radical constructivist view, believed to have been created by the intentional and unintentional machinations of powerful groups in order to maintain power over marginalized ones. This worldview produces a moral imperative to dismantle these constructions. Underlying these alleged social constructions is the most deeply concerning of them all: the belief that what is in urgent need of disrupting is the simple truth that science itself, along with our methods in science of data gathering, statistical analysis, hypothesis testing, falsifiability, replicability, is a better way of determining information about the objective reality of any observable phenomenon than our non-scientific approaches, cultural, religious, magical. For grievance studies scholars, science itself and the scientific method are deeply problematic, if not outright racist and sexist, and need to be remade to forward grievance-based identitarian politics over the impartial pursuit of truth. Heather Hanging, who along with her husband Brett Weinstein was violently run out of Evergreen State College by grievance studies radical identitarians, tells us that the attack on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, is no accident, because once scientists are silenced, narratives can be fully unhooked from any expectation that they be put to the test of evidence. The program here by leftist identitarian, radical constructivist, epistemic relativist is clear. They want to abuse science and they want to degrade science. They want to associate logic, evidence, testability, rationality, and all those things with taboos like white supremacy, so that their ideas cannot be subjected to tests, the need for evidence, data, and so on. And so to summarize, I would like to propagate the notion of the philosophy of science continuum, which is a continuum of realism and anti-realism, with scientific realism on one side, scientific anti-realism in the middle, which attempts to draw a distinction between that which can be directly observed and that which can't, and epistemic relativism, which takes that uniquely true descriptions of reality are not possible, that science does not access the true nature of reality. Now, there's a potentially interesting viewpoint of solipsism, but the most common academic viewpoint is the radical constructivist view, which is that there is a reality, but any knowledge is part of a social construct. The concepts of true and false are not universal, but context dependent. And that view feeds into a vicious loop of abuse of science, grievance studies scholarship, and radical leftist identitarianism, which then feeds back into epistemic relativism and radical constructivism.
Well, I hope you found that perspective interesting and useful, but most importantly, true, because I am not an epistemic relativist. But also, if you believe that science is on your side, or that you are on the side of science, if you have a sign in front of your house that says, "In this house we believe that science is real," then make sure that you are not on the side of or allied with epistemic relativists and radical constructivists, because they believe that science is not real, as we have seen. If you believe that science is real, make sure that you oppose those trying to spread epistemic relativism and radical constructivism through our society.